Good morning, class. This week for psychology, we'll be talking about intelligence. There's a lot of good material in the text about intelligence, and our textbook is going to spend a little bit of time looking at some of the standard tests, which we will cover, and then they're going to spend a little bit more time than probably we will looking at various intellectual disabilities, though I will cover a little bit of that. What I'm hoping for this week is that we kind of have a more freewheeling, open discussion on the social implications of intelligence and where we place intelligence as a priority in our society and the affect of such things. Because there's a lot of good social theory that looks at not only, how do we construct who is intelligent, but also what those constructions mean for our society at large. Before we do that, I do want to talk a little bit about our quizzes, assignments, discussion boards, as we kind of round into the more or less home stretch of the course. There can always be that tendency to make sure that, or to drop off. So I want to make sure that we are being ever vigilant or extra vigilant perhaps to ensure that we're getting all of our work done to finish strong as best we can. As things come up, I know we're going to get busier and busier because I know, in our class we have a paper, in my other class there's papers, other teachers are going to be giving group projects. So there's going to be no shortage of work for you to do. But I want to encourage you guys to stay strong as we start to head down to the busy period. As always, I'm here for help, support. I guess that brings me to our paper. I want you guys to make sure that we are taking the time to look at that. So far, I don't think I've heard back from anyone on the details of the paper. So quite possibly that could mean that everything was amazingly clear, cogent, readable, knowable, and I made a perfect assignment. I think there is a equally likely or probably more likely possibility that we just have a lot of students that haven't had the time yet to get into the paper. I definitely want to caution you guys, even though it's a short paper, it is not the sort of thing you want to put off, like any paper for any class. It'll be much, much easier if you start working on it now so that you can get feedback from me. How do I pick a topic? Is this topic going to work well? How do I incorporate psychological ideas? So there's a lot of critical thinking that I want you to do with the paper. And so if you need a sounding board for that, or if you just need some guidance in general on that, I want you guys to be willing to come to me. So hopefully in the next week or two, I will hear back from several of you. But there's still a lot of points left in the course. So between the paper, the final, and then all the assignments and discussion boards and quizzes between now and then, the majority of our grade is still ahead of us. So I just want you guys all to, keep the faith and keep going. But without further ado, I guess we should turn our attention towards intelligence. So looking at some of the basics of intelligence, we have to ask ourselves this first question: what is intelligence? What are the trappings of intelligence? How do we know it when we see it? We have this question: who is smart and who is not? And it all goes down to this basic definition of what is smartness and intelligence for us. What makes someone, I want to say clever per se, but yeah, clever is a good word. Because I want us all to first realize that this is not some sort of universal truth, a universal reality. We are steeped in a specifically Western tradition of what is knowledge, and how do we measure how many people know knowledge. Like within Western philosophy, we place a great emphasis on rhetoric and discourse, so that things like from our philosophical history, we have this entire class of people known as the sophists, who demonstrated their wherewithal, their intelligence, by arguing with one another, and so their ability to argue becomes a sort of litmus test for their intellectual credibility. And from that tradition, we have people that countered that, but they countered it through argumentation. People like Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. And so we have these key Western figures who are steeped in this tradition of rhetoric and argumentation. And so we have this sort of, and this is mirrored heavily in our legal proceeding. I don't know if you watch a whole lot of procedural crime dramas, but it's the good intelligent arguments from the lawyer that put the criminal away. Ideally, of course. But what we have is this sort of our ability to articulate arguments is the measure of how we see intelligence. And being loquacious can oftentimes be conflated with that sort of intelligence. But then we also have figures of intelligence that are kind of the extreme opposite examples. People that are not necessarily smooth talking per se. And this is where we think of our scientist types. People that are, so discombobulated in a social setting because their mind is preoccupied by that sort of higher theoretical thought, kind of like a Russell Crowe in A Beautiful Mind, and all the sorts of difficulties that his character endures because he is so intelligent that he can't necessarily acclimate to our normal social norms and mores and expectations. But generally speaking, when we're thinking about intelligence, I like to think of it as trying to put it, because it's difficult to pin down exactly what do we want to call intelligence. Because once we do pin down a definition for intelligence, there are all sorts of entanglements that definition comes with. I was, for instance, listening to a podcast by Sam Harris the other day, and in his podcast, what Sam said was that intelligence is the processing of information. And this was a podcast actually on, it was a TED Talk. It was a TED Talk on ethics of robotics. And he was talking about how artificial intelligence will someday vastly outsurpass human intelligence. And what are we going to do when we are no longer the most capable creatures in the universe? And he said this is inevitable because intelligence is the processing of information. And since computers process information, they will be able to process information faster than us. And therefore, eventually they will just far outstretch us. So it's an inevitability that humans are going to eventually meet more. Well, what he was arguing was that eventually we are going to create God in a super artificial intelligence, and what do we do in that time and place when we can no longer control such things? But it all rested on his idea of intelligence is simply the processing of information, and this is where I had this initial revelation that maybe that's not the case. Because when I thought to myself, the processing of information is definitely one criteria, and it's one easy criteria that we want to jump to for intelligence. Intelligence is the ability to facilely manipulate knowledge within the mind. This is kind of going back to Piaget's theory of development, that as we develop and become mature adults, our brains mature, we're able to manipulate and articulate instances in our mind. We're able to calculate in our head not only numbers and things like that, but calculate experiences. And this is a very tricky thing, very important thing to think about. But we also have to think about information is not necessarily just, or intelligence is not necessarily the processing of information, but it's also the processing of misinformation, which is something that is unique to human minds in such a way that machine code doesn't quite function at the same level. This is one of the things that makes the human mind very spectacular. We not only are able to process information, but we're able to process misinformation. Like for instance, I don't know if you guys have ever seen these like paragraphs where all the words are jumbled up, or the letters of each word are jumbled up. And the only thing that stays constant is like within the word, the first and last letter, but everything else gets tangled up in between it. And so you start reading this paragraph, and then you come to realize that all the words are off, but you're still able to read it nonetheless. Now, this is because we have this like gateway mechanism in our mind to make sense of things that are close but not quite there. And so a series of misinformation that is from a mathematical level, from a linguistic level, from a grammatical level, complete garbage, can actually make quite a bit of sense to us, because we are not only processing information, but we're processing misinformation at the same time. And this is a huge difference between the human mind and a machine mind, because within the confines of a machine mind, we actually, as it is directed by machine code, for anyone that studies computers, the second that code goes wrong or the wrong number is put in, the code ceases to work. And so intelligence for humans is a very different thing for intelligence for computers, because even as I misspeak words here and there, you continue to understand what I'm saying, or understand the overall message that I'm getting at. But when it comes to machine learning, every misstep is a cessation of the learning process. It's a break in the machine code. And when you have these breakages, these slippages, the machine ceases to function. It is the proverbial wrench in the gear. So the big difference between machine learning and human learning, machine intelligence and human intelligence, is that while a computer has a significantly faster ability to calculate the square root of 636 times 4,647, computer can do that significantly faster than I'll ever be able to do that. It is contingent upon the precise input of data, not necessarily the erroneous input of data. Whereas human brains work upon this heuristic device, where we are constantly learning not only through rightness, but we're learning through wrongness as well, which is an interesting thing to think about. So all this goes to say is that whatever we decide or argue for is the definition of intelligence, has implications. And it's not an easy definition. It's one that I can't necessarily state here and now. This is the unequivocal definition of intelligence. Another thing that I thought about when I was thinking about Sam Harris's definition of intelligence, intelligence is the processing of information. Well, information is a form of energy being expressed. Like all matter in the universe. Merely just matter is energy. And so the expression of energy is transference from one point to another, and then manifestations thereof. And so you put 5 times 5 into a calculator. Well, you have processed information to get the answer of 25, but does that make the calculator intelligent? Probably not. A more extreme example. You drop a water balloon onto a kid and it bursts. Well, again, this is a transference of, it is a processing of energy. Is this in some way a form of intelligence? And again, we would probably say probably not, even though it's processing information, which is at its most fundamental level a form of energy. So what we have here is this sort of like theoretical, and again, this is when we're talking about intelligence, this is a very Western thing to sit here and say, let us argue the minute details in this sort of dialectical discussion on what is intelligence. And this is not even, and this is just again within the Western tradition. You might have a very different, a very allegorical, metaphorical sort of discussion between the sort of big figures in like Eastern tradition. I'm thinking of the conversations I've read between like Confucius and Lao Tzu and Zhuangzi, where these characters are not necessarily sitting there proving their point, but proving something entirely different. Maybe that there isn't even a point. Through use of metaphor, and so they're not necessarily constructing these sort of, oh, let me get my logical argumentation in place, but let me compare it to the koan. What is wisdom but the sound of one hand clapping, that sort of thing. And I know the koan is often abused as a sort of trope, but it does have its purpose for us understanding the sort of like complexity of this question of what is intelligence. So I guess where we're at this point now is we're sitting here trying to define what is intelligence, but we're also at the same time trying to say that we seem to have a gradation of intelligence among human beings, and so how do we start to classify intelligence in a way that's meaningful for what we need intelligence to mean? And we would have to ask ourselves, why do we need intelligence to mean something? And a lot of that comes from our sort of like modern economic social hierarchies. We use intelligence as a way of differentiating not necessarily upper class and lower class, because there's plenty of people living within the upper class that are complete fools. Though that sort of rigid caste system is definitely an earlier manifestation of social order. We did have a time and place where being of nobility led people to believe that it was this sort of like preordained divine right to be part of that nobility, and that we are structured within a class system based on God's dispensing of the attributes, as it were, so that the tanner, the miner, the coal worker, the chimney sweeper were born with the talents God had laid forth in order to perform those tasks and live in that sort of life, whereas nobility were given a different sort of gifts that they must cultivate and responsibly organize, i.e. their minds. I'm not going to necessarily offer a whole lot of commentary on how I feel on that one way or the other, but it's definitely been a perspective that has existed in the past. I mean, we don't live in a caste system anymore, so yeah. I mean, stuff like that's kind of weird to ponder, but it's definitely interesting to look at this sort of retrospection at the ways people kind of justified their own position and justified their own privilege. But in today's roles, we definitely have a sort of differentiation between blue collar and white collar, and we definitely have these social orders that, while not as rigid, we do try to reinforce sort of, if you're doing this sort of work, you need to be this sort of smart. We want smart doctors, we want smart lawyers, we want smart bankers. We don't care if the construction worker is having deep thoughts inside of his head so much. I mean, from a social perspective, not from a personal perspective. I don't want to entangle the two at this moment, because there is definitely much concern in my mind for what's going on inside of construction workers' ed, as well as pretty much anyone's mind. But we have this sort of existing order that rests upon our ability to map out or socially engineer who is smart and what do we do with those smart people. And from that social need, we have born examinations. Examinations specifically to kind of more or less ferret out who is smart and who is not. Now, why would we have these sorts of examinations, you might ask? And, you know, I have offered up already this sort of like social order sort of schemata, and there's definitely a lot of weight to that, but a lot of it just comes from our natural human curiosity as well, that we all experience to know and understand. But examinations are also a part of creating basically hierarchies of intelligence, as it were. And this is where things like, you know, not only do we do this in terms of like IQ tests, like the Stanford-Binet and the Wechsler, but we also do this in more like rigid performance-based ones, like the SAT, the PSAT, the ACT. These are all forms of general knowledge tests that are designed to, quote-unquote, rank and quantify how smart you are. And though they are saying at some level these tests are different from IQ tests because they're ranking your competency for college, your intellectual competency for college, an IQ test at some level is ranking your intellectual competency for life. So let's not necessarily dispel the notion that one is not doing something fundamentally different from the other, because they're both operating under the same sort of mechanisms and guises. Though that being said, when we're looking at like the Stanford-Binet and the Wechsler test, the one difference between these tests and your normal sort of applied knowledge tests is that they are designed not necessarily to test your competency with one framework in mind, i.e. college entrance, but they're designed to test your general perspicacity for knowledge. So we're looking at not only, or in contrast to the ACTs, we're not looking at how much you know about writing a college-type essay. What we're really looking at is how do you know, or how much you know about how much you can know. How do you demonstrate your learning skills? And these are through more general knowledge type questions, adaptive reasoning type questions, spatial reasoning type questions, linguistic or verbal reasoning type questions, and not necessarily as much of a factual knowledge base. On an IQ test, you will not see very often, you know, what is the capital of Vermont? Because that is not the sort of thing that really measures well or tests well for general knowledge. Because, take for example, you give that test to 100 students that live in Vermont, and they're going to say, "Well, oh my God, Montpellier, we know." I think it's Montpellier. I am not 100% certain at this point. But so we have this sort of sorry. So we would have this like class from Vermont, and they would know exactly what their capital is. And then you'd have a class from Washington, and none of them might know where it is. And so you'd have this like regional bias. And so nowadays they don't have too many of these sorts of general knowledge questions that float into the exams. But these are the two main tests today that look at IQ, the Stanford-Binet and the Wechsler. Thinking about what they're saying, I want us to look at whoa. I don't know how that popped up, but I want us to look at what's taking place underneath a bell curve. Well, that was really weird. Because when we get to these sorts of general statistical tests, we get to this bell curve here. A bell curve is a statistical model for plotting deviation, where the average person will reach the average grade in a large sample size, will reach this middle point, and then what we will have are everyone else will be a little bit higher, a little bit lower, a bit higher, a bit lower, quite a bit higher, quite a bit lower, but the majority of our people are just going to score in the middle. And this is what we call a bell curve. You guys might have heard about this like in high school at some point. Hopefully you did, because this is basic statistical theory. But oftentimes people would say that, we're going to be putting our grades on a bell curve. The average student will be getting a C. We'll have a few people getting B's, a couple people getting A's. And likewise, we'll have a few people getting D's and a couple people failing. While the bell curve is an excellent model for mapping out participation on something like an IQ test, horrible model whatsoever for applying grades in a classroom setting. Because, what happens if, everyone gets everything right because they studied and they worked hard, etc., etc. So wow, that's a strange thing to say. Beware of classes and teachers where, a bell curve is the expected deviation, because occasionally it's not. Occasionally I've had classes where all my students did, or the overwhelming majority of my students did really well, much higher than what a bell curve would suggest. Or classes where I had an abnormally high amount of non-participating students, and so things did very poorly. So anyways, we have this sort of bell curve. And on an IQ test, what we say is the average IQ is 100, which means that or have the reasoning capacity of someone who is appropriate for, and it's actually based on age, so your age. Whereas someone that has, like, let's say, a 110, 120, or even all the way up to 130, those are going to be all within the first two standard deviations. And that takes us all the way to here. Right there, 97.7. So within 97.7%, I think, is the standard 2 deviation model. And so 97% of all people are going to fall within that. And so depending on the test, and this is where, like, the Binet test is slightly different from the Wechsler test. Each test offers its own deviation for how much one standard deviation is. One of them is like 24, one's like 28. We could always look up the details on that. But the further away you get, so if 24 is your standard deviation, and you get a 125, that means you're already outside one deviation. If you get a 149, you're outside 2 standard deviations. If you get a 173, you're outside 3 standard deviations. And, if you've ever heard TV shows where they kind of fictitiously talk about, this guy's a genius of all geniuses, he's going to have like a 170 or even a 180 IQ level. Because, that's where, when we estimate people like Galileo, that's where we throw them on. So I want us to understand, though, that the overall majority of us will fall between the 70 range and the 130 range, which also coincidentally is where we have, socially speaking, kind of broken off and said the 130 and beyond is a genius, so to speak. And the 70 and below 70 is where we actually would say people start to be mentally handicapped or intellectually disabled. And again, what we're talking about are percentages of a population that fall on this sort of bell curve, this normal standard distribution model. So this becomes a very important thing for understanding what the IQ is doing. What it's really trying to do is give us a complete breakdown of the population and where people might fall relative to one another. relative to one another. And this is where our book will spend a lot more time talking about the extreme highs and the extreme lows, the figures that have been classified as a genius, or figures have been classified, and all the things that fall within the scope of being classified as intellectually disabled in some way. And that can people that might be mentally retarded in their developmental growth, so they have a problem understanding things. People that have chromosomal abnormalities, or people with things like autism or Fragile X syndrome. There's quite a few within the collective possibility of what can go wrong. And so it's important to, I guess, keep in mind all the various possibilities therein. But our book covers a little bit of that, and you can definitely go look at it. But I think it's more important to recognize these sort of upper and lower limits, these liminal stages between what we call a genius and then what we call someone with an intellectual disability, and that it's still the but the reason I don't want to spend all of our time or what time we have left this week looking at all of those things is because in some ways I feel like they can end up becoming a distraction for what IQ is doing and what it's offering to us. Because what I want to stress is that our IQ is not necessarily a reflection of future success. Because, and I say this because, success is not being driven solely by a measure of intelligence, whether that's our social perception or otherwise. In fact, they've done quite a bit of studies to look at, first of all, how do we measure success? Because that's a tough one. It's something I talk about quite a bit in my ethics class. How do we measure what is the good life, and what does the good life look like? And it's kind of like what we talked about at the beginning when we talked about intelligence. The way you give something a definition can frame the future discussion. So your definition is never going to exist in some sort of neutral vacuum. There's always going to be these sorts of contingencies to that definition you use. So when we're talking about what does it mean to be a success, when people start to say a success is being really smart and everyone knowing that you're smart, well, then you've already framed this sort of like intelligence quotient into your success story. But if we're thinking about like success as a monetary litmus test, then we would have to actually separate intelligence out of that equation, because the people that have money are not necessarily the most important or most intelligent people based on these sorts of IQ tests. In fact, it's not the opposite, but there doesn't seem to be a huge, overwhelming correlation between pure IQ and earning potential. And a lot of that comes from other things that shape our values. Like you might be a real hard worker that studies and becomes a doctor, becomes a lawyer, and your IQ may just be perfectly average, perfectly normal. So you're now earning hundreds of thousands of dollars, but you're not necessarily in that genius range, so to speak. So IQ is not something I want us to walk away from this week thinking about in terms of a measure for success. Because the danger of that is that it leaves us with a very incomplete picture of what human beings are capable of and what makes them unique. It is not merely our intellectual prowess that offers us our station in the world, but it is other things like compassion, connection, empathy. And so what we have is as our textbook calls it, and we have a whole human to consider. Someone that goes beyond the pale of raw intellectual data. One of the things I used to joke about, well, I mean, not that it's like funny or anything, but okay, I would one of the things I used to ruminate on was this idea that, because I used to do a lot of writing and poetry, was that, the only people that killed themselves more than poets were mathematicians. And mathematicians are this like notorious, obsessive, brilliant genius. If you want to go study math for your entirety of life, you're usually pretty clever. But there was this sort of I don't want to say stigma. There's this sort of idea that a lot of very famous mathematicians have killed themselves over the years, just like a lot of very famous poets, Sylvia Plath, sort of things, have killed themselves over the years. And something with this idea of intellectual excellence, be it in wordsmithing or mathematicians, has driven them to this sort of imbalance that we would probably ultimately define as not being very successful. Self-immolation is not necessarily the most successful conclusion of life. But what we have here is, again, this sort of paradox between, we cannot merely look towards IQ as a sort of measure of what it means to be a successful person. And furthermore, when we want to look at raw IQ data, and this is a much, much longer conversation than we can have in the next couple minutes, but it's to think about how IQ data has in some ways been, like, I don't want to say distorted, but misused, perhaps. Like, there are literally people out there who will go around saying, well, we've done IQ tests on people in sub-Saharan Africa, and they're all lower scorers than people who are living in America, because Americans are smarter or Europeans are smarter, as if this sort of de facto IQ test being delivered in a sort of standardized format that we're very comfortable with in our elementary schools, where doing tests are completely normal, is easily comparable to the IQ scores of an entirely different culture base. And so what we have is people who look at IQ data and they start to take quantitative data and assign qualitative values. This means this person is smarter, better, more fit, is where it starts to take us from curiosity to agenda very quickly. So it's something to keep in mind when you hear people talking about IQs and hear people talking about IQ data and what are we doing with this IQ data. And so I want us to kind of like end today thinking about how do we qualitatively understand the whole person. And in the future, we're going to be kind of looking more into wellness. We got a couple weeks ahead looking at some abnormal psychology, which is what people think the entire psychology class will be about, looking at weirdos, which is kind of mean in its own right. Probably shouldn't have phrased it that way. But what we have is this impetus that I would give us to resist making qualitative statements based on this sort of quantitative data of how we understand psychology or how we understand intelligence. And then I guess lastly, I would want us to leave, if anyone is curious about further exploration, is that not only had there been the standard the standard inquiry into IQ or intelligence, but there have been many people that have proposed alternative forms of intelligence, where we also talk about things like an emotional IQ, which is our ability to read and perceive and understand emotional situations, which is maybe much more important to our psychological well-being than our rational IQ. But then we have other people who theorize and explain and start to quantify not only our ability to think about things from just reasoning and rational, but other forms of IQ, like spatial IQ, color IQ, our ability to have intelligences in multiple expressions, so that someone like Mozart We're like, well, this guy is a musical genius. Well, that is a form of intelligence, even if he may not necessarily do as well as some people might do on a sit-down test. We should not ever doubt that there's a sort of genius intelligence behind Mozart's performances. And while some people might be mathematically intelligent, there is also other forms where it's like thinking conceptually or thinking theoretically. So, people that are able to conceptualize big theories, philosophers, this sort of like heuristic intelligence. It's driven not necessarily by our ability to either memorize data or facts, but driven by our ability to think about big concepts, the most challenging concepts. And again, this is just another form of potential intelligence. So there's a lot at play here. A lot more that we can study and inquire and discuss. But I'm going to go ahead and end here. And make sure, again, we're getting our routine daily work done, because that's going to be very important coming up in the future. And otherwise, I will catch you guys next time.